So we will be recording this conversation, and we seek your consent for the same. So to start off, Kidki Collective is a group of scholars committed to building public dialogue on history, politics, and culture. We came together in the middle of the pandemic to think about regions and places. Since then, our attempt has been to move beyond the academic community and to speak to the larger public sphere. In this attempt, we have published 3 sets of public articles hosted by the News Minute and The Wire. We intend to work with, we also have the intention to work with various languages of the Deccan. And we began working we began this series of presentations in April 2023 with the talk of Himabindu, who discussed the Telugu periodicals and linguistic networks in the princely state of Hyderabad. The second talk was by Pramod Mandade, who discussed the complex politics of memorialization of integration of Hyderabad in the Marathwada region. Shashikiran spoke on Telugu print cultures of Madras Presidency. Namrata Kanchan spoke on Deccan literary canons. And we also had Indivar, who spoke about politics, property, and planning in global Hyderabad. Firdos Soni spoke on Malegaon Jatra and thinking through the region through fairs. William Bamber's talk was on historical links of the Deccan with the Middle East through goods. And our last talk for the year 2023 was by Dr. Chandrabhanu Murthy, who spoke about Dalit Marxism in colonial South India. And we are resuming our Kidki Collective's conversations again today with Dr. Hamza Iqbal's talk that's titled The World-Literaturization of Hindi-Urdu from Zore's Hyderabad to Jaun's Karachi. So we have... Sorry. So we have Professor Afsar, who is going to interlocute this talk. And Professor Afsar is a faculty at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a well-known poet and a writer. His first book was titled The Festival of the Peers, Popular Islam and Shared Devotion in South India, which was published by Oxford University Press. And his most recent work and the most widely discussed work is Remaking History, 1948 Police Action and the Muslims of Hyderabad. And an excerpt from his book was also published as a part of Kidki's series, The Dangers of a Single Society. Apart from academic activities, Professor Afsar writes in various Telugu literary magazines and is the editor of the online Telugu magazine Saranga. And today's talk, the presenter we have is Dr. Hamza Iqbal, and he is the assistant teaching professor at Barrett Honors College at the Arizona State University. His research interests focus on comparative literature in South Asia, Islamic studies, and aesthetic. So thank you everybody for joining us, and we will over to Professor Hamza. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hima, and thanks everyone else for being here for this talk. Thanks, Yamini, for the invitation, and thanks, Afsar Saab, for interrogating and interlocuting this conversation. I suppose I'll just go ahead and start with the talk, and then I guess we'll just go from there. All right. So am I audible enough though?
Yes. Yes.
All right. So let's start with an impasse in our reading practices. Begins Nurdan Gurbilik her thought-provoking article on the rise of the Turkish novel. Gurbilik continues. Criticism in Turkey, not only social and cultural criticism, but also literary criticism, is mostly the criticism of a lack, a critique devoted to demonstrating what Turkish society, culture, or literature lacks. Thus, such statements of lack, we don't have a novel of our own, or similarly, we don't have a tragedy, a criticism, a philosophy, or an individual of our own, are typical of a critical stance that positions itself from the very start as a comparative one, presuming that it becomes convincing only when it talks about something the other has, but we don't have, pointing out to the persistent lack, the irremovable deficiency, the unyielding inadequacy of its object, the Turkish culture, end quote. The concern that occupies us at present is different, for its object is different, but is similar to Gurbilik's concern in that the scope of and around its object is similar. For that scope also has to do with attending to a statement of a lack that pertains to its own unique lacking object. This talk's point of departure, then, is situated in a certain statement of lack, and in this case, the object that is lacking is criticism, specifically from the Urdu literary tradition. After the loss in the War of 1857 at the hands of the colonial administration, the Hindi-Urdu Muslim speakers in India came to feel the need for an identification of their own unique and proprietary literary culture, and concurrently, the need for the reformation of this literary culture, which, upon its identification, was found to be decadent. However, once the statement of reform was articulated and addressed, as a result of which new kinds of literary and cultural forms emerged, that is when this particular statement of lack, that is of criticism, began to be voiced. Three figures with such proclivity were Babai-Urdu, or the father of modern Urdu, Maulvi Abdul Haq; the other, a young scholar from Osmania University in Hyderabad, Deccan in 1920s by the name of Mohiuddin Qadri Zore; and finally, Urdu's most iconic modern poet of today, Jaun Elia. I begin this discussion by considering the emergence of a linguistic and education project that was initiated in Hyderabad, Deccan in the 1920s by figures such as Abdul Haq and Zor. Before I go on to touch upon how this project, which had at its core the language of Urdu, had a bearing had a bearing upon the early nostalgic years of John's literary and intellectual career after his migration to Pakistan post-partition. Ultimately, I suggest why this project, which I call the project of World-Literaturization of Urdu, failed, and the classical poetics of the Urdu lyric, that is the ghazal, and the art of poetic recitation or performance were already antithetical to such a project from the outset. Okay. In 1925, a young scholar at the age of 21 finished his BA studies from Hyderabad, Deccan's newly founded Osmania University. Upon completing his BA, with honors in Urdu and Persian, he immediately enrolled in the MA program and stood first on its examination. He was promptly provided a scholarship by the government of Hyderabad to go to England for further education, where he went on to receive his PhD in linguistics at the School of Oriental Studies with a dissertation titled Hindustani Phonetics. He then worked with the British phoneticians Daniel Jones and Lilius Armstrong, and after a brief stint at the Sorbonne in France, he returned to India in 1930, where he became affiliated with his alma mater. This scholar, Sayyid Ghulam Mohiuddin Qadri Zore, contributed substantially to the Dakhni Urdu language, its history, phonetics, linguistics, and its literature with dozens of influential books. One of the books which Zore published was in 1925 as a recent BA graduate. The book was a critical Urdu text titled Ruh-e-Tanqeed, or The Soul of Criticism. In this book's introduction, its author notes that this text was intended to fill the gaps surrounding a methodological approach to the art of criticism, which has thus far been missing from Urdu literature. However, this gap or lack of the object of Urdu criticism, which Zore sets out to achieve through his work, is written in the Urdu language. It was to be achieved through Western critical frameworks. Interestingly, Zore's Ruh-e-Tanqeed was intended to provide standards of critique and judgment for Urdu, but did not discuss any text from Urdu, barring one, a legendary 18th century Masnavi or a long narrative poem. Besides that, Zore does not include anything from Urdu literature nor from the other Asian languages, specifically Arabic, Persian, and Hindi. As he admits at the outset, he reasons that firstly, collecting data for such a task would be exorbitantly arduous, and secondly, quote, hardly any efforts have already been undertaken to capture ideas about criticism in these languages, except only cursorily, like in Arabic, through comparisons, repudiations, and other appearances, while in Persian through journals, papers, and tazkiras. On the other hand, Europeans have made criticism an exclusive and a formal art, and books continue to be published on the principles and objectives of literary criticism in their countries. End quote. One thing to consider is that Zore was very occupied with the Urdu's national status in India, which had become a pressing one in the wake of the formation of modern Hindu and Muslim identities at the time. In order for Urdu to flourish or even survive in India and at the same time become a globally recognized language, there needs to exist a robust practice of literary criticism. Quote, if we wish to see our language amongst the list of world's cultured and progressive languages, if it is our desire that within a short span of time we see our literature side by side with the English, French, and German literatures, if we wish to witness personalities such as Shakespeare, Bacon, Goethe, Kant, Rousseau, and Carlyle, and Tolstoy amongst our polity, and in this country, and if we want to prevail in our claim that it is the language of Urdu and only Urdu that can most conveniently become the one common language of India, then we would have to direct our energies towards the proper tenets and chief objectives of literary criticism, he wrote. And these proper tenets and chief objectives of criticism were to be taken from the West. Zore's book thus Zore's book thus is divided into two parts. The first part focuses on the fundamentals of critique and comprises 10 chapters. Topics for 9 out of these 10 touch upon the virtues of critique, birth of literature, the task of the critic, etc., almost all of which are found in standard college anthologies and taken up in introductory graduate seminars on literature today. It was only in the last chapter of this first part where Zore examined the text from the history of Urdu to apply his theories of criticism and demonstrate their applicability for his readers. In the second part, which also had 10 chapters, Zore reviews the history of Western literary criticism as he begins with the ancients, Plato, Aristotle, Longinus, and makes his way through the medieval figures towards the modern Western poets and critics from France and England. The first part of the book only assumed the pretense of reaching out to the poets and poetic genres from South Asia, but the second one did not even enact that. Yet, in a way, at the young age of 21, Zore had written in Urdu his own anthology of the history and trends in Western literary criticism, even if the book did not contain any particularly seminal or innovative ideas. But Zore, after all, was indeed only a youth of his time and place, and that place was mainly the new educational institution by the name of Osmania in Hyderabad. The Osmania University was founded in 1918 by the ruler of the princely state of Hyderabad, and just a few years after its founding, the young Mohiuddin Qadri Zore became one of its earliest students. The late Kavita Datla has detailed in her fantastic manuscript the pedagogical and political role of the Urdu-speaking Muslim intellectuals of Hyderabad Deccan through the long 19th century. Osmania University was founded by the ruler of the princely state of Hyderabad to attend to his court responsibility to diffuse among his subjects an education which had become one of the most significant markers of the modern, especially in relation to the study of and research in Western science. End quote. This institution then was meant to prioritize a secular curriculum that was based on English and Western ideas. However, the impartment of this new pedagogical model was to be conducted in Urdu. It just so happened then that with the founding of the new university, other new radical possibilities emerged. Yak kadam वहशत से दर से दफ्तर इम्कान खुला. With one step of wildness/dread, instructions from the Journal of Possibilities were revealed, remarks Ghalib so pertinently. In November of 1919, writes Tatla, the All India Khilafat Committee was born, marking the beginning of a mass movement of civil disobedience that brought Hindus and Muslims together in political coalition. Thus, for so many of the Muslim men who acted as teachers, translators, and administrators at Osmania University during the Khilafat agitations and into the 1920s, it was precisely the fate of the nation, the people within its territories, and the language of national communication that took center stage. And that is when Baba-i-Urdu Maulvi Abdul Haq entered into the picture. Abdul Haq, who was one of the founding members of Osmania, came to view the institution as a feasible site for initiating the future-oriented and progressive project of revivification of India and bring it to par with other rich and advanced nations. This project, as he conceived it, would be pedagogical and would rely upon an engagement with and the transmission of modern and secular, mostly Western arts and sciences, and would take place primarily through programs of translation. Indeed, translation became one of the largest and most critical projects for this new established university. Moreover, the path to the realization of this project would go through the process of vernacularization of Urdu according to Abdul Haq and other Muslim intellectuals associated with Osmania. That meant ejecting English and making Urdu not just a medium for scholarly discourse, but a uniform and official trans-regional language that will serve to unite the whole of India. Essentially, what it meant to do was to squeeze knowledge and wisdom out of English and then bring the resultant nectar into Urdu, and then letting that nectar work its magic after the whole nation is made to drink it and accordingly pledge its allegiance to this new linguistic nationalist project. Now, it was precisely in this project that young Zore as a student critic partook, and his book Ruhe Tanqeed was very much an outcome of such participation. Zore's text was based upon a propagation of the classical idea of emulatio, which is to say that by emulation of something admirable, one's fortunes, even for an entity as large as a nation with millions of people, can change for the better by mimicking the progress of other more successful ones. It was to propel one's community onto a stage shared by other superior cultures and nations, where Urdu language too could have Shakespeare's and Goethe's of its own. But so impressionable was young Zor under the ideological shadow of Abdul Haq, and by extension under the reformist fervor which had gripped Muslim intellectuals since Sayyid Ahmad Khan, that he not only lashed onto the ideas for a progressive universal future, but also developed a distaste for the decadent local Indian Muslim past. That distaste is manifested in and through his book Ruhe Tanqeed. By bypassing Urdu or regional poets in favor of Western ones, by dismissing frames of aesthetic judgments from uh, South Asian languages, such as Persian, Arabic, and Hindi, by seeking cues only for nature and reality in poetic analyses, and by discounting the classical genres of the Romantic, Masnavi, and the Ghazal, Zor shows through his book that he's following in the footsteps of um, of his 19th century English influenced reformist predecessors such as Muhammad Hussain Azad and Sayyid Ahmad Khan. Zor's book on criticism, therefore, expectedly invited a series of criticisms against its content, one of which being that the text was too Occidentalist. Since it barely engaged with the local genres and writers, the critics thought that his book read as a translation of Western critical frameworks into Urdu. But Zor responded to this criticism by saying, quote, "It is not at all a translation or a compilation of Western works. Ruhe Tanqeed is absolutely not attempting to claim that those frameworks which are found exclusively in the tenets of English/Western criticism should be transferred to Urdu. On the other hand, after introducing all frameworks from the foreign tongues, the book has selected a few such frameworks with which all Urdu writings at the present juncture can be viewed." End quote. Thus, in 1927, Zor decided to publish a second volume of the book, where he begins by outlining significant features of criticisms in relation to several prominent Urdu poets and writers, and where he included only three English writers, Thomas Gray, Horace Smith, and Matthew Arnold, to whom he devoted a total of 2 chapters. However, in one of his chapters in this volume, Zor interestingly devotes space to the 10th century Persian historian and minister Amir Akbalami of the Samanid court and his famous Tarikh Nama, or the Great Book of History. Zor remarks upon, excuse me, upon how Zor remarks upon how after the Arab invasion and the consequent conversion of Persians to Islam, the latter began to develop as a learned community, and the Persian language got revived. Now, I argue that Zor's reasoning for discussing the Tarikh Nama reeks of his experience as a native subject of a society which, in a contest with an alien culture, underwent a cultural and linguistic reform of its own. Zor is therefore keenly aware of the historical trend and attributes the linguistic renaissance of Persian language and literature to the disappearance of the Arab Abbasid era and the emergence of the Samanid era. It is clear from his writing that Zor had something in mind of sorts for a renaissance of Urdu language too. There was something that needed to be stripped off from Urdu for it to rise as a consequent language in the evolution of a world history and on the stage of world literature. He writes, quote, "The manner in which writing and composition in Urdu was considered a reprehensible idea till the Ghadar, that is the 1857 rebellion, was akin to the situation at the beginning of the Samanid political era, wherein the influence of Arabic had seeped into Iran to such an extent that, let alone writing a prose book in Persian, even possessing a taste or passion for Persian poetry and rhetoric was deemed detrimental to the honor of the intellectuals and learned folk. End quote. For Zor, then, I propose that something which needed to be stripped off from Urdu was the influence of the Persian language, which by this point had already been labeled a foreign traveler who came and interfered with the local language of India by the aforementioned Urdu reformist scholar Muhammad Hussain Azad. In other words, Urdu needed to be rid of the significance of orality and the lost world of the pre-1857 India, for there seems to be no other particularly significant reason for him to include a chapter as succinct as it was on the nature of Persian prose through Balami's work and draw a parallel between the state of Persian in 10th century with Urdu in the 19th. After his chapter on Balami, Zor pens a detailed analysis on the Dakkani poet Kafi Hyderabadi. Now, this is not the place to scrutinize Zor's view on Kafi in detail. However, the two possible reasons for Zor's consideration of Kafi, who by that time was not even a Sahib-e-Diwan or a published poet, are worth noting. Firstly, Zor wanted to partake in the process of putting Hyderabad on the map with regards to the Urdu language in the same way Delhi and Lucknow were in the past 2 centuries. In the Urdu literary culture, these cities, which were known through their poets, had come to have such immense literary importance that they became their own unique schools of poetic composition, the Delhi school and the Lucknow school. The birth and rise of Zor's alma mater, Osmania University, was already intended to achieve something similar for the city of Hyderabad, and Zor wanted to play his part by detailing the craft of a local poet such as Kefi to make him a representative of the new burgeoning school. Dak Dehlvi, although in Hyderabad during this time would have been a bigger name when it came to the men of letters, but he was a Gair Mulki, which is to say non-native or outsider, and was deemed to have an association with the old Delhi school of poetry. Meanwhile, Makhdoom Mohiuddin, who becomes notable much later, would have just been a teenager. By bringing Kefi to the fore, Zor wants to do away with the manners of the archaic schools, but wants to continue the progress of Urdu from a new center, and by the same token signal towards the novelty of the whole process. Indeed, after his return to Hyderabad at the end of his graduate education in 1930s, Zor founds an organization called Idara-e-Adbiyat-e-Urdu, which is still functional today, and which was aimed towards servicing of the Urdu language exclusively in the Hyderabad Deccan region. The second reason for Zor's consideration of Kefi seems to do with the fact that the former exclusively read positivist elements in the latter's poetic oeuvre. Zor writes, quote, Kefi's poetry reveals a genuine portrait of the social and political conditions of his era. This is a quality that is found in very few poets of Hindustan. In Kefi's poetry, this quality is so superior that Deccan can rightfully take pride in it. End quote. This second reason seems so important, in fact, that the first one seems to stem out of it. And so it is with an emphatic discussion of Kefi that Zor finishes his second volume of Ruhe Tanqeed. Now, allow me to account for my reason to center Zor, Abdul Haq and this educational project in Hyderabad during the long 19th century and their relevance for the literary cultures in post-partition South Asian nation states. Firstly, Jaun Elia, the third figure in this equation, and who's currently the most popular poet in urban North India and Pakistan, knew Zor's book, The Ruhe Tanqeed. Secondly, it was with the blessing of Maulvi Abdul Haq, who had also migrated to Pakistan after the partition, that John's elder brother, Sayyid Muhammad Taqi, began working on a translation of Marx's Das Kapital, in which he was assisted by John. In light of their association, it is conceivable that Abdul Haq may have influenced and shared some recommended readings, such as Zor's Ruhe Tanqeed, with the budding young poet. But what is substantial here is the continuity of Abdul Haq's Urdu-oriented secular pedagogical project that had started in Hyderabad, in which first Zor and then John partook. Thus, the intellect by Datla and others also features amongst the discourses on literature and culture that become significant in post-partition Karachi. Abdul Haq's enthusiasm for the translation project of Marxist texts by John and his brother reflected his belief that the material and intellectual progress of the whole nation, this time Pakistan, would be paved through one national language policy and with the continuation of translation practices from Western secular curriculum into Urdu language. My argument, however, is that this project, which involved evicting English and making Urdu the national language first in India and then for Pakistan and bringing it toe to toe with European languages, what was not just a project of vernacularization within the national borders, but also of world literaturization. The view of such vernacular ideologues and language advocates appears to be that by continuing the process of delivering Western arts and sciences through one single language, the locals would simultaneously be encouraged, coached, or even coerced into adopting Urdu. Eventually, through education institutions and their pedagogical practices, which will be conducted in one single language for everyone, locals would come to assume a collective national subjectivity of their own accord and acquire the superior Western knowledges as an object. There's a special kind of contemporaneous community which language alone suggests, above all in the form of poetry and songs. Benedict Anderson reminds us. Similarly, one of the key tenets of world literaturization process, according to Damrosch, is indeed translation and circulation. But it is not clear if it was lost upon Abdul Haq, Zore, and then John that the process of world literaturization or possession of our own Shakespeare's and Goethe's could not be possible merely by translating and circulating Western texts into Urdu. Writings from Urdu would have to be translated into Western languages so the West too can witness what spectacular Shakespeare the Urdu speakers have produced. Now, the whole issue was that such texts did not already exist in this relatively young language that largely comprised of an oral literary culture. There were no scientific or philosophical works, and literature was mainly the form of poetry, of which the lyric or the ghazal, which was the most prevalent, did not even lend itself easily to the tasks of the translators. Not only does a translation imperil ghazal couplet's intrinsic harmony, but hardly any language can reach the top echelons of world literature solely through poetry in the 20th century. Perhaps these intellectuals then thought that once the masses are enlightened by way of Western knowledges that would be thrusted upon them, they will be able to utilize their newfound enlightened selves to produce literatures and sciences which would be at par with their Western counterparts. And once these literatures and sciences get translated into Western languages, then ultimately that would take Urdu further, where it will become one of the world's major languages. In a short 1959 polemical piece on Urdu's magazines and issues, John writes, quote, "We need to have a global benchmark for publishing. For better or for worse, this era is not an era. Today we would have to do so bearing in mind the international standards. And we must be even more focused because now expectations are being kept from Urdu that it will assume the role of the one common language of Asia, and this expectation is absolutely justified." End quote. Abdul Haq had already expressed such hopes for a pan-Asian Urdu presence too. In a speech at Punjab University in 1948, right after the partition, he proclaimed that India is enthusiastically trying to hurl Urdu out of its borders, but they cannot completely succeed in expelling Urdu. There are still many supporters of Urdu in this world. Urdu will remain alive, it will advance and will achieve a high position, and it will become the common language not only of the Indo-Pak subcontinent, but also of Asia. End quote. Thus, it should also not have been lost upon Abdul Haq, Zore, and John, especially by virtue of them being colonial subjects, was that the discursive course, that is world literaturization, was to be taught through brutal conquest and widespread social and linguistic violence. Instead, what they chose to envision was that Urdu would organically grow to be a major force on the world literature stage without any need for vicious political intervention or any ethnic, linguistic, or religious opposition. The scholarship and the ideas from Urdu writers would push it towards the path of lingual glory, or so they must have thought. Except that could not have happened. The project of literaturization of Urdu was bound to fail from its outset in Hyderabad, Deccan, and then again in post-partition Pakistan for so many diverse but conspicuous reasons that it is unwarranted to even mention them all here. Yet I shall mention just one. The reason for the failure of literaturization project was for Urdu was intrinsic, which is to say that it had to do with the Urdu language and its history itself. The heritage of lyric poetry and orality is rooted extraordinarily in the Indo-Muslim civilizational ethos, which does not lend itself easily to large-scale projects of translations and mass circulations. This untranslatability is somewhat akin to Damrosch's assertion about certain literary works which are closely dependent on detailed culture-specific knowledge that they can only be meaningful to members of the originating culture or to specialists in that culture. My notion here, however, does not really have to do with the meaningful in the content, but beautiful in the language. Even today, the genre of the ghazal is arguably the most favored within the Urdu literary complex. And that is precisely what makes Urdu antithetical to the modern process of literarization, which for Persian as a foreign language began with European Orientalism in the Age of Discovery, and which relied upon poetics, prose writings, and oral histories with equal concentration. On the other hand, the local languages by this time were not subject to curiosity, but had become a tool to be used for administering the local populations, and thus the British colonial administration in India too could not be instrumental in this regard, as they had already seen what the ghazal offered in terms of its motifs through Persian language a century ago with Sir William Jones. And the Hindi-Urdu ghazal was not going to offer them many radically new ideas on that front, and neither were they looking for these ideas, their inner logics and their meaning. The thing it could offer to them was that subtle, untranslatable beauty, which could only become the purview of a genuine and a committed ally such as Goethe, and never of an imperial administrator. One question to then consider is why in post-partition Pakistan, the idea of imagining for Urdu a future wherein its geographic ambit extended beyond South Asia gained currency among writers such as John. I offer that John's and his likes subscription to such an attitude, and their extravagant claims for their native language were more a result of their early literary associations in the post-colony than their desire for achieving a national and international Urdu hegemony. In addition, it was also the consequence of their experiences as recent migrants to a new country with new cities, such as Karachi and Lahore, where they had to renegotiate their entrenched small town North Indian Muslim, or what Raisur Rahman identifies as Kasbati values, for the only single state they could carry from their lost abandoned worlds in India after the catastrophic partition was their language. Meanwhile, they were also being told the same thing as Zore was before them, that their language and its speakers, who were mostly North Indian Muslim migrants in Pakistan, were under the threat of getting subdued when both were deserving and had the potential of re entering the stage of historical action and confront the challenges of the post colonial state slash modern globalized world. Having been inveigled by his milieu, the young and impressionable Zor bought in. Meanwhile, in case of John and his fellow poets in Karachi, the moment of profound identity and existential crises compelled them to take the plunge. But before I conclude, a quick remark about the world-literalization of Urdu is imperative. As previously mentioned, this project of world-literalization of Urdu, which began in Hyderabad and continued in Karachi, was bound to fail from the outset. And this would be true not just for Urdu, but for any language which cannot be disseminated through some form of economic or political invasion. But did the project of world literalization of Urdu indeed fail? The short answer is that it did not. It succeeded, in fact, but succeeded only for Urdu Hindi or Hindi Urdu, and neither did this project ironically succeed through literature. What it has succeeded through is the world cinemization or film capitalism, and that is evident by the global appeal of Bollywood, or what is termed the Hindi cinema, but which relies on Urdu poets and writers for song lyrics and dialogues. We can gather the scope of this world literalization project, if we can still call it that, by recalling the instance when Obama, during a diplomatic trip to India, slipped into one of his speeches a line from one of the most iconic dialogues from one of the most famous Bollywood films of all time, the Kajol Shah Rukh Khan starter Dilwale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge. The dialogue writer, Javed Siddiqui, is also a screenwriter and a playwright. His name suggests that he is a Muslim and would be perceived as such in the current historical moment in India. Does that mean he wrote the dialogue in Urdu? It is with the gradual ascent of Bollywood or the Hindi-Urdu cinema on the global cinema stage that the project of Abdul Haq, Zore, and Jaun has reached its climax. The medium has shifted from literature to film, or for that matter, to moving images in general with television, YouTube, streaming platforms, etc., which requires several individuals. And so we may not be able to have Goethas and Shakespeare's, but there are a plentiful of extraordinary creators in these mediums who inevitably have furthered the cause of the language without really wanting to further the cause of the language. And I should clarify that I'm not attempting to re-articulate the aforementioned phenomenon as the emergence or endurance of an Urdu or even a Hindi-Urdu cosmopolis, which has been done recently. For the Urdu cosmopolis relies on an existence of a local linguistic community in global and diasporic configurations. The World-Literaturization project, on the other hand, required the language to not just live outside of its original geographical borders, but for it to become a mode of far-reaching and consequential intellectual and literary output across populations. Besides the project of world cinemization, as for the fate of Hindi Urdu, we can say that it is akin to the fate of the biryani outside of South Asia. Sure, you can find it in some shape or form almost anywhere in the world, but for you to really relish it, you would have to go to a South Asian restaurant. It would never feature as a staple in the menu of any other restaurant on the street, which would almost always have at least something that is French, Italian, or just plain old English. Thank you. That was all that I had.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hamza. So I now request Professor Afsar to join us and then have a discussion.
Thank you so much, Kidiki, for opening this window. And then thank you, Hamza, for a lovely presentation. And then this topic is so important at this point because of the politics, both nationalism and localism. But I appreciate the way you returned to this 1920s Hyderabad Deccan, and then like also opening the debate between Urdu and its global networks, which is actually very like crucial. Uh, so I see there are like uh, four major kind of dimensions that I want to take from your presentation. One is about reading practices itself and the lack of criticism, and then pointing out that lack within the literary culture of Hyderabad Deccan. And of course, it's equally important in terms of other languages connected to Deccan. So how other languages came in contact with Urdu, and then how that interaction made those languages a rich culture, both not only in literature but also in everyday life. So that, but the idea about lack of criticism, which is actually not confined to Urdu, that's also equally important for other languages that are connected to this geographical space. So I believe a lot of work will be done in future connecting Urdu and then correcting these lacks. So how in 1920s there was an entire generation that was struggling with on the one hand with global and then Western modes of modernity, and also on the other hand these local versions of modernity. So it's a very important dimension. And then the second one is the idea of renaissance of Urdu itself is so important for me, particularly growing up speaking these two languages at home and outside uh, the home. And then the very role of Urdu. Of course, you also mentioned about pre-partition and post-partition situation, but particularly in the pre-partition days, the very role of Urdu was crucial in the making of personalities, in the making of community, in the making of literary cultures. So this presentation actually helped me so much to understand those uh, different aspects of interaction. So, of course, I actually believe we need more such studies as Urdu is connected to Telugu, which I did a little bit in my recent work, and also uh, Urdu, and then Marathi, Urdu, and Kannada. So, but I actually look forward to those opening up those spaces, linguistic spaces, and connect it to both everyday life and also literary culture. But of course, the topic that you took today is uh, the question about Hindi Urdu, which is well debated. But I appreciate the way you made your own way into this debate and the interactions between Hindi and Urdu, which actually were so crucial in the making of progressivism, progressive writing in the late 40s in Hyderabad. Of course, when you think about the translations itself, which is a very big activity in the late 40s, even in Telugu, most translations they came from Urdu, not from Hindi. For instance, so Premchand, most Telugu writers they know him from Urdu, not from Hindi. So these politics of languages, particularly ki Hindi, Urdu, are like uh, key in the making of Deccani literary culture. And the last thing about this renaissance of Urdu is Usmania as a center. Of course, Kavita Datla did an excellent job there, but I still feel there is some space to talk about how Usmania evolved into a progressive center, not a traditional center, right? So also, of course, Kavita spoke more about Urdu and how Urdu became a secular language in this particular context. But also, it's also important that we need to understand how Usmania became a vernacular center for so many other languages, including Farsi, right? And the third dimension is Hyderabad as a literary center. How do you understand Hyderabad, Deccan? I'm not worried that much about Hyderabad after 1956, but before 56, how would we understand Hyderabad as a literary and cultural center? And also, because I am also curious about religious transformations in Deccan, it's also like a prominent religious center. And then we need to understand how Sufism plays into this, right? So that's also another, maybe you might develop something later within this work, okay, how Sufi elements also restore Urdu practices, Urdu literary practices, and Muslim cultural practices. So the idea, but one thing that I noticed from your study is this trying to understand intellectual histories, individual intellectual histories. The people that you mentioned in your paper, they are of course still understudied, but they are, I believe, their role in the making of Hyderabadi Urdu particularly the long 40s and 50s, and then the way they refashioned their life stories after several models. It's not just Western model, right? There are a lot of other like non-Western models as well in the making of these alternative personalities, right? So I believe at some point I think you should also look at how those non-Western, of course, Jor was emphasizing about Western model, which was not unusual at that point, right? So there were other scholars from North India who were also trying to use Western model, right? So, but Jor, I see in his later work, as you demonstrated, he was also he also started talking about vernacular modes, right? So, but that connection between Western and then vernacular, of course, when you think about Hyderabad, the Deccan, and its this idea of development under Nizam's rule, so there is always a dialogue between Western modernity and then local modernity, right? So even including the early phase of printing press, then the shift between Farsi to Urdu, right? So this is actually a continuous process. So scholars, intellectuals like Zor, and then they were actually a product of such a dialogue, right? Uh, and then, but most important, what I felt is this is very important for us to connect these personalities, the eva- the evolution of their intellectual work should be connected to Muslim political thought, particularly in the late 40s and then the beginnings of 50s. Right? Jore's personality perfectly fits within that discourse, right? And then also there is this role of Idare Adibiyat, wonderful institution that actually also published so many books in Telugu, right? Focusing on Qutub Shahis and then the Urdu Telugu interactions, right? So unfortunately, we don't have any studies on this particular literary institution. So that institutional work, which was very specific for the late 40s and then 50s, should be highlighted even now, particularly now, right? Uh, and then, of course, I actually enjoyed reading this debate between vernacular and world literature. World literature is one of my favorite topics when it comes to literary and cultural studies. You did a great job there by connecting this idea of world literature. Uh, and then also, like, on the other hand, highlighting vernacular modernity. But what I see in the context of Hyderabad Deccan particularly is there is unlike like colonial British India places, Hyderabad Deccan has a lot of emphasis on local modernity. That is just because of Urdu, the influence of Urdu, the influence of Muslim cultures, right? So maybe I actually want to read more like how you are going to frame this into your argument and then bring the evidence from Hyderabad Deccan, right? And then these are like I have two questions, Hamza, but these are not like major things. But one thing I'm always curious, even including my work, and also a lot of scholars here. Uh, like who try to connect or discuss global networks. So we have Eric, and then we have all the Khidki team. They are also interested in this kind of debate about how do we define vernacular in the context of Hyderabad Deccan, right? Since you are focusing on literary culture, is so important for us. Of course, some of us we discussed about Eric and me, and then Amini and the other scholars, Swati and Himabindu, we all discussed about this idea as connected to other languages, right? But within this like current scholarship, then you go back to this 1920s and 1940s, and then how do you see the progress of this debate on vernacular modernity, right? That makes sense, Samja? Yeah. So the second question is the particularly towards the end of the paper, where the core of the paper is there actually, right? So you started talking about political interventions and then their connection with language politics, language dilemma, right? Which is so important, particularly the post police action, post Hyderabad, the post Deccan of police action, post police action, right? So within this discourse, within this debate about the language and the politics, and then both colonial politics and then post-colonial politics, and then the partition politics, where do you locate Hyderabadi Muslim being, Muslim individual as a political being, right? So when I look back into all these materials coming from different languages, particularly Urdu from Hyderabad, I actually see this Muslims Muslim community, Muslim intellectuals. They are making huge interventions into political history there. So we need to study that political history from the lens of Muslim subjectivity, right? So within your work, where do you locate this Muslim person, Muslim self? Uh, Sorry, I took long, but I want to stop there. Thank you so much for this opportunity, Kidki and Hamza. Look forward to the questions and the discussion. Thank you again.
Thank you, Officer Saib, for those remarks, comments, and also questions. Should we do more questions together and then get to them, or maybe we can start the conversation and then also like go in order where we have some question and some discussion?
Yeah, maybe we'll take a couple of more questions and then you can start responding to it. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions?
Sure, I can add a question. I think there's already quite a lot on the table, but maybe I can try to connect. Oh, sorry, there's a little bit of fog on my screen. Maybe I can try to connect to some of the things that were already said by Afsar and raised, of course, in the talk by Hamza. Thank you for sharing this exciting work with us. I wanted to just ask about, I'll touch on one thing. There's a lot of different really exciting material here, but I'll touch on one thing. And that is the sort of transnational component, this notion of Urdu as a pan-Asian language and thinking about Urdu as a kind of language of all of South Asia. And I do think, one concept to pick up that Afsar raised, that I think will be of great interest to scholars of language and South Asia in general, is the question of vernacular. How exactly do we use a term such as vernacular? We've had discussions of things such as cosmopolitan or trans-regional languages as well. How might we categorize Urdu, which usually is characterized as a vernacular within sort of scholarship of South Asia and linguistics and so forth, but it seems to actually occupy some space in between what we might call a kind of large-scale global cosmopolitan language and a vernacular language. So I would like to, think about how we can talk about that vis-a-vis actual practice and use, but also a vision of somebody like Zore. And the other part of that is the other transnational component. I'd like to hear a little bit more about if and what Zore's mediations beyond the subcontinent, or at least beyond the sort of Urduphone world, as we might call it, were in working out these ideas of Urdu's potential role having a much bigger scope. Was he in conversations with people in Europe where he studied previously? Was he in conversations with people elsewhere in the Muslim world, connected places such as the Ottoman world or the post-Ottoman world or Central Asia? Or linguistic scholars of other languages within South Asia. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks again for this exciting work.
I think we have, I think Khurram Murad had raised his hand also. Do you also want to ask? Then probably Hafsa can respond.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you, Hamza, for the presentation. I have a question. I mean, the question of vernacular have been raised. Just taking that point further, I'd like to ask that, especially dealing with the question of Urdu within the Deccan or like prior 1948 geography, like what we would call earlier a Nizam state. So when we're engaging with this Urdu language or Dakhni Urdu, does it like does this engagement necessitate that to kind of universalize? I mean, since you're looking it objectively, does it necessitate that we sanitize it from the larger northern discourses that are around Urdu, and only can we then engage properly with its relation with the more local languages like Telugu or Hindi, Telugu or Kannada or other languages. So does that become a framework uh, when we are dealing with vernacular languages? I mean, with a variety of Dakhni here. So that would be the question. Thank you.
Hamza, maybe you can respond.
Okay, that's great. Thanks everyone for again questions and some comments. And I think let's maybe begin with Khurram's intervention with regards to sanitization from northern influences or discourses. Khurram, can you maybe elaborate on what are you referring to when you say sanitization from those influences?
No, I mean, like the work of Kavita that was mentioned, right? Like how Urdu have been secularized. So, I mean, the frameworks like secularization of Urdu or necessarily distancing, I mean, like separating it from the very everyday living of the speaker. So, be it, okay, to be more specific, like Muslim speaker, do we necessarily alienate the religion aspect of it? And only can we then like, I mean, if I can make that binary of secular and religion, so
Mm.
I mean I mean in that sense, like, do we need to sanitize it?
I think, and Afsar have also touched upon this. To my knowledge, the secular pedagogical project had to do with incorporating Western frameworks, Western knowledges, and didn't discriminate amongst, oh, we shouldn't be reading this or we shouldn't be reading, let's say, translations of the Bible or adopting them or teaching them. But again, Osmania, as Afsar Saab mentioned as well, it was essentially it became a center for these kinds of knowledges and teachings, but it was also teaching religious, like it was also giving religious instruction, right? So my impression is not that it necessarily required to, like, oh, either it's we can, if you're doing the secularization thing, this project, then it can't or could not talk or reek of any influence of Islam or any religion for that matter. I think again, to some extent um it was already within Zore's purview that, oh, this has something to do with Muslims and Islam in India at the time, as to what was happening, like the distinction between Hindu and Muslim and Urdu and Hindi were becoming more and more concrete. So it was already sort of that when he's talking about Urdu, he is without mentioning now, I think he's at least again in this work, and where my work is like my chapter. This chapter is really focused on this one work. I've not had a chance to, dwell or look at in detail more of his subsequent works that come. So when he's writing here, he doesn't talk about Islam or being Muslim as such to a great extent. But of course, all the people that he's referring to, not all, but most of them, like Azad or um, and others around this time are these Muslim intellectuals from North India as well. And they themselves were like Sir Sayyid Ahmed Khan and stuff as well. So, I think it was already in his scope. It just, I don't think he necessarily chose to articulate it in that way. But there was a sense that, this has to do with regaining some sense of Muslim like significance in that region, perhaps, and maybe in the broader region as well. So, like Afsar Saab was saying, it was sort of intertwined with the idea of, getting some political sovereignty or like space for Muslims at the time. And also in the national, in with regards to the national politics. So I think I suppose that's what I would say to that. Um, and then I guess we can also come back to the question on vernacular, which was mentioned by everyone, I think. And yes, I do agree, it's always in relation. The vernacular or the vernacularization would always be in relation to, other languages. I think in Pakistan, one could still say Urdu is a vernacular, but at the same time, Urdu is the major national language, or is considered to be as such, in the face of which all other regional languages are indeed treated as and also discriminated against, as being vernaculars, like Balochi and Pashto, for instance, specifically, but even Punjabi, which is probably the largest spoken language in Pakistan, but it's still treated as such. So I think over here, mainly, and I should admit it, I mainly just borrowed from Datla's work on how, when she chooses to frame the question of vernacularization in that way, without necessarily, I mean, I wonder if it could have just been called regional language rather than, using that phrase or that term or that concept of vernacularization. So yeah, I think it's something to think about more for me as well, as I'm, using this term and this phrase and this process as to how it's fitting in this context, but also it sort of continues with regards to Urdu, both in now in more, in post-partition Pakistan and India. So yeah. And okay, so coming back to another question posed by Eric about Zore's mediation outside of South Asia, let's say with other people who were not from there necessarily. So I think, I mean, all the influence that he had, and again, this is based on what I've seen or read by him, which is not a lot, not terribly a lot, because Zor becomes important for my dissertation through John, and in fact, it's only through John on whom I've written is that I encounter Zor, and then I just, go in like take a bit of a deep dive into Zor. Um, I think with regards to, again, like I was thinking about some English scholars with whom he worked in England also then shaped his thinking and understanding of these issues around language and hegemony and, influence and translations and circulation, which he again brought back. And he came soon after. He didn't even spend a lot of time in England or France. He got back really soon, probably finished his PhD in 3 years or something, which is remarkable. So based on my knowledge, I think obviously it would have played some part. I also didn't notice this discourse a lot. I have a sense that, once he came back, and it's something I would want to focus more on as to how his thought develops and evolves after that 1930s period. Let's say in 40s, when, let's say, Abdul Haq is forced to leave India, um, by Abdul Kalam Azad, I think, and he has to, being an octogenarian, uh, is forced to migrate to Karachi with only some of his works. So I wonder how that relationship may have been between Abdul Haq and Zor as well. But I know that Zor started to focus. I mean, obviously, he was really prolific, started to write so much about so many things, including, his work in Kashmir, and just about Dakhni language and stuff. And also, he wrote a book on Ghalib eventually. Even though initially in the Ruh Tankid, we see his sort of scathing disapproval of the classical ghazal. So I remarked this in my broader chapter in my dissertation, that it was interesting that he wrote on Ghalib, like devotes a whole book on to Ghalib, even though he would have just initially, castigated these people, and like wouldn't have bothered with thinking much about uh, ghazal writers as such. Now, in the second volume of Ruh Tankid, he does talk about these figures like the classical Urdu ghazal poets, but again with this tone of some approval, but mostly rejection. That and even when he's doing that, he's trying to identify, you know, naturalist or positivist elements in their poetry as well, which again becomes something which progressives eventually take too, with regards to, like, oh, Ghalib was a progressive in terms of how um, inclusive he was, and in his thought and stuff. So there's some strands of those as well. Zor may have evolved from that position with regards to Urdu and its hegemony in the Spanish context. I know Abdul Haq died in 1960s, but I think in his case he was still very uncommitted to this idea about Urdu and Pan Asia and its significance, and national language and knowledges. John, being a poet, I think initially, again, I like I mentioned, in 50s till around 50s, he was occupied with this idea. He himself migrated from Amroha in 57 to Karachi. But I think from 60 onwards, he kind of loses that. And I talk more about this in my dissertation in this longer chapter, and that's manifested from the fact that he is completely invested in the classical ghazal genre. So initially, he again um, doesn't approve of it. He wants to do away with it, and he wants to focus on these works which will have national and global appeal, which would be by definition or by extension prosaic works about philosophy and stuff. But with in 60s onwards, he's full fully back to the ghazal, like poetic recitation, like writing poetry, while at the same time he is still working on this Urdu magazine which he introduces. Um, so there is a bit of a rupture in Zor's or in John's own like work. Now with Zor again, I'm not exactly sure how his thought would have gone from that, like from him being in his 20s and 30s to, like, let's say when he was in 50s or 60s, or I think he died in his 60s or something, right? So I'm curious to see that myself, but I've not had a chance to look at his subsequent works in great detail. I focused mainly on this Rohit and Keith because of so much influence of what I saw of the reformist, Muslim intellectuals before Zor's time, and then also how this particular strand is taken by some writers who migrate to Karachi, North Indian writers who migrate to Karachi and Lahore in Pakistan and are still focused with this, or have this preoccupation with the language and its place in the new country. Afsar Saab, can you repeat the first question you had? The very first question.
Right. I was asking about how do you. So actually, it looks like you already responded to it. It's a question about defining vernacular in terms of Urdu literary culture in the Hyderabad Deccan. So we have these several languages, several religious groups, and then multiple identities. It's not just Urdu, right? So I actually feel that we need to discuss vernacular in relation to these other languages. Looks like you
Oh
already
yeah,
responded.
okay. Yeah, no, I think my knowledge would be limited in that regard as well. I do think that it was interesting, this phenomenon when I'm encountering and reading as to the Nizam. I mean, or the kind of space Urdu is given with with Osmania, and then the kind of stage or place that it takes from that point onwards. Um, and again, people like Zor and having trying to make Hyderabad the center of Urdu, like the new center of the 20th century, unlike Lucknow and Delhi, which were the older centers. So there was this looking towards the future idea, this idea of progress and going forward, and this new center with new ideas and new poets, which was perhaps in the air around this time. Although Kafi Hyderabadi doesn't really take off, it seems, as like really prominent Urdu poet. I think Makhtoom becomes much more significant, I feel, but he has an extremely different orientation. Whereas Dag was sort of, I think, again towards his later age when he was in Hyderabad. So he's still considered like a remnant of the old poetics. So it's interesting for sure, and I hope to actually focus more on Makhtoom and his politics, and how, although we see a lot of progressive politics in his poetics, in his approach, but I'm curious to see for myself as to how Hyderabad, or discussions around language perhaps, may have featured into those discussions and his thought and stuff. Yes, Sandeep.
Yes. Hi. Am I audible? Yeah. Thank you, Hamza, for that very nice talk and the follow-up discussions. My background is of theater studies, and my question is from that perspective. So when we look at the development of this progressive intellectuals in this South Asia, we find a very strong connection between the progressive political network with the progressive literary network and literary and cultural network. So, of course, there's the PWA, which comes up later on, YCI, which comes up later on, IPTA, for example, which I have, that is where my question comes especially from. And the development of progressive political movements especially since the 1920s and 30s and all of that, centered, of course, around Delhi, Lucknow, Allahabad, Mumbai. So what I don't know, and thank you for that, is what was the picture of Hyderabad at that point in time? Because Andhra has a very, very strong political performative network, right? It has very strong political presence in the theater sphere. That is something which I know about. What I don't know is whether the this literary sphere had a similar, which it seems it should be, but I'm not very sure about it because unfortunately I can't read Urdu texts, and that is a restriction that I have. So yeah, so that is my question. So what connection of world literaturization do you see in when you look at parallel the progressive political network and the progressive literary cultural network? Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandeep. Okay, I should admit, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of knowledge of how theater may be in this equation. Of course, I do also believe, like you're saying, that there'd be a very close proximity between progressive political networks and poetic or, performative or theatrical like groups and stuff as well. I think so. I know obviously Makhtoom, who is, staunch progressive, also writes stuff for films. He has some great songs and ghazals which have been used in films. I imagine he was connected to theater perhaps in some way. Now, with regards to politics, I think again he may have been someone who's I'm somewhat aware with some of his works, which are again traditional ghazals, which could be read, of course, politically based on interpretation, but they are quite. One can say they're also very classical. But I am also somewhat aware that he was himself, as a poet, was very involved and very much influenced by and not just like in terms of only that let's just write poetry around along those lines, but also actually try to practice it. So I think with regards to him, I could say I'm not sure. And again, this was with John as well, and I mentioned Das Kapital too, on which he worked with his brother. Now, interestingly, in Pakistan, it just takes a completely different trajectory because it never really is allowed to, take off, strictly speaking, by the state. So John himself says that in his early years, while he was in North India in Amroha in Uttar Pradesh, he was drawn to theater and he used to act and stuff and everything, but it was very like different kinds of theater, not necessarily progressive or political. After they migrate to Pakistan, they are his brothers, at least the elder brothers, one of which writes translates, but the eldest brother is extremely political and progressive. But I think it extends somewhat to being North Indian migrants in Pakistan. So they become affiliated with the local political organization in Karachi, which is the infamous or famous MQM. I don't think, again, it may also have to do with the fact that it's not really allowed. There's hardly any space for that kind of, expression in Pakistan. So on paper, they're certainly progressives and leftists, but and to the extent of even writing about it, but I'm not sure if they were fully like not they're not like Habib Jalib, for instance, who is actually, out there on the streets protesting and getting arrested, or even Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who actually becomes so much famous, um, and is uh, associated with the party in Pakistan and stuff. So I don't think any of these brothers, like with regards to John and his elder brothers, who are significant in Pakistan, but not necessarily with regards to practicing that kinds of politics. Um, because just there's no now in India there is still that kind, and so in Pakistan these poets and writers who are political or choose to be political are only doing it very subtly. And again, to that end, they're often using the ghazal genre because in ghazal you can kind of get away with saying things, which you wouldn't be able to say in nazm, or even if you were to put it on stage, it would manifest itself more directly. But in ghazal, the lyric and the anonymity and the lyricality and the genre itself sort of allows one to sort of say things which can be read in so many ways that a lot of poets actually did that in Pakistan, but in India, I think maybe there was more space. Maybe there were more, modes and mediums which allowed people to have been able to express or, sort of be political and also while crafting their art. So I don't know if I even answered your question or touched upon it, but I think, I mean, there's certainly that space with regards to politics and progressivism. Now, I think with regards to world literaturization, my view, like the way I have phrased it, and there's like 10 million, I think, definitions of what it is, and scholars are still trying to define it. So I've taken a couple of definitions as my points of departure, and I've tried to just explicate them along those lines. And I think what one of the things was, because often even today, the hegemonic languages in these discourses are European languages, and so how they became significant on this world literature stage is through colonization and politics and conquest and all of that stuff. So for me, I don't think there's any. Again, like I talk about cinema, which is a completely different thing, but through literature only, I don't think it could have been really. Even with Fez, whose work is translated, who gets the Lenin Prize. I mean, sure, but he is also someone who's very shrewd and conscious of his, of himself. So his work comes in this world global stage of literature and politics, but there are certain reasons, there are certain conditions which lead to that possibility. I mean, Habib Jalib perhaps may have been more progressive. I don't know, but he is not as prominent anymore, at least in this discussion. So I think world literature, I don't know to what extent does it really have to do with progressivist, outlook, or really, I mean, its commitment to those ideals or ideas. I do realize I may have completely, gone in some different direction with regards to your question, though.
That's fine. That's fine, Hamza. Thank you. Thank you very much for your response.
Hi, am I audible? Hi.
Yes.
Hi, thank you, Hamza, for a very interesting talk. I have little bit different question. Like 1905, Japan's victory over European nation is a very big impact in a nation-making process. So my question is, I engage with the Marathi part of Marathwada part of a language, and I saw multiple references to Japan as an example. Even in Osmania University setup, there are multiple references comes up to Japan. So my question is, you also refer to Kavita Dadla's work. So my question is, in Kavita Dadla's work, there is a clear dialogue between Gandhi and Maulavi Abdul Haq about national language. And if we just suppose that national language, making of a national language, there is a clear debate between Maulavi Abdul Haq and Zore about what is that Urdu national language. So my comment about is, how do you look at, if we say, rather than looking at as a world literature, Urdu making as an pan-Islamic, this whole project, and state is a very central in a making of Urdu. For example, in Hyderabad, state is a very central in a making that. Rather than posing that project as a world literary project, how would you respond if I say it's a nation-making project? If we go back even in Pakistan, early phase, it's again nation making process. So yeah.
Thanks, Pramod. Actually, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, the World Literature Project is based on nation making project. So the French, German, and Spanish like significance on the world literature stage is because once they've been assumed as nation states and these national identities, these borders have come into being, only then it's possible for them to go beyond and reach that world literature stage. So it is, the World Literature Project is very much like a national project. So interestingly, at least in Zore's work initially, in this period, I at least didn't get a sense that it was being directed to a separate nation state. But sure, when they're talking about India, like national language of India, of course they are these, and that's why they sound so absurd and you know I mean kind of crazy almost to me, that they have these ideals that, oh, language could be the national language of the whole country. So it's a national linguistic, it's a nationalist linguistic project is how I'm phrasing it. And in the same way in Pakistan as well, it is for the nation state, it is towards the nation state, it is in the service of nation state. And once it has gotten there, once it has been established there, then it has these kinds of, at least with regards to Urdu, this pan-Asian or global significance. The point of departure is assuming that's already a national, like a language of significant national significance, like for everyone, like one single language for the whole nation.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? You can take one last question, maybe.
Yeah, this is Sajjad. I want to.
Yes, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Well, Hamza Saab, about Urdu being a national language, I don't know whether it was ever a national language or not. But I firmly believe that Urdu was the only language which held the attention of the entire subcontinent. And right now it still holds the attention of India. Whenever we protest, whenever we love, fall in love, both emotions are expressed only through Urdu. One of the leading writers of Hyderabad has once said that इनकलाब जिंदाबाद से गरीबी हटाओ तक इस मुल्क का हर नारा इसी जबान में रहा है. क्यों रहा है ये नहीं मालूम, whether it is a national language, it should be a national language. वो डिबेट अलग है, मगर हकीकत कुछ और है. It has always been Urdu which is provided. And if you look at what has been happening all around you, I've been studying Dakhni. That another point which I wanted to raise was there's these days a blur between Dakhni and Hyderabadi. I think you need to draw a distinction between the two, because Dakhni was an entirely different language. Uska literature slowly tapered off, and what we call Dakhni today is not actually Dakhni, but it's Hyderabadi. Predominantly what was imported from North India and what was, what morphed into a dialect here. But the original language was Dakhni, and that is what Zore was trying to bring focus on, because there was this feeling that Urdu had moved away from the masses after it was impacted by the North Indian phase of its development post Wali. Waha more Persianization took place, and that is where we lost out. That is my belief too. I have written about it. अब ये है कि I am still surprised that even today when we protest, we quote Faiz, and we quote Faiz throughout India. In the recent protests that we have had of CA and NRC, the most quoted line was from Faiz, and it was translated, of course, into a lot of other languages of India. I think Urdu, I don't know, I'm not into linguistics and global trends, But what a little I know of Urdu is that despite it being written off time and again, there is this resilience in the language. It always comes back. तो मोहब्बत और इनकलाब ये दोनों चीज़ों में अगर आप देखते हैं तो सिर्फ उर्दू ही है जिसका आप सहारा लेते हैं. यू माइट नॉट बी ए speaker of Urdu, but even then, when you fall in love, I don't know, for some reason you fall back on Urdu. जोर साहब का ये है कि आपने खुद कहा है वो कि दैट वाज ओनली रूह तनकीद ही आपने उनकी गौर से देखी है. उसके बाद जोर साहब का मेजर काम जो है दखनी पर रहा है. अब ये अजीब बात है कि मौलवी अब्दुल हक ने भी जो शुरू में जो काम किया, व्हाट ही डिड वाज ऑन दखनी, ही स्टार्टेड पब्लिशिंग दखनी टेक्स्ट, बट the difference was Zor felt, of course, that was the mulki non-mulki divide that was coming into play in that then political setup of Hyderabad. And Zor was promoting the mulki point of view and trying to revive the old Dakhni culture. Along with it, the Dakhni language and its literature. So he spent most of his time doing that. And Idara Bayat-e-Urdu, the focus primarily was on Dakhni. You also spoke about Makhdoom, and not just Makhdoom, but a lot of the progressives were very close to Zor. And of course, they formed a group, and I remember the many results of this interaction that Zor had, because Zor was the teacher of all these people. He was their professor at the university, and he did have an impact on them. The basic point is that there has to be a differentiation between Dakhni and Hyderabadi Urdu, which I feel most scholars miss out on. And the second thing is that the political relevance, of Urdu is still there. And I think one of the questions recently just now raised was about Abul Kalam Azad and Maulvi Abdul Haq. If I remember, Gandhi and Abdul Haq. Actually, I think it was a letter of Pandit Sundarlal to Nehru. It's a very beautiful piece that he's written, wherein he says that he actually challenges Gandhi to read the headlines of a Hindi newspaper and an Urdu newspaper, and then tell him which of the two he readily comprehends. So that was Pandit Sundarlal's stand on Urdu, and it's being it has a larger reach than Hindi at those times when this language debate was going on. Thank you for this excellent presentation and paper. Looking forward to more of your work.
Thank you, Sajjad Saib. And you're absolutely right. I think I stopped at Rohit Ankit. So I think from that point onwards, focus for Zor especially becomes, the Dakhni language and that region. So I think until this point, at least till in this book, and maybe when he's gone for his PhD, when he's writing this dissertation on Hindustani phonetics, from that point onwards, now I think Dakhni becomes his central preoccupation. And yes, I also agree about, Urdu sort of being very conveniently utilized by people who are in love, but also, no, and in politics, not just on one side, like not just, to protest or towards revolutionary ends. I mean, it's being used by everyone from all sides. I think a few years ago, there were some shares or couplets that were, mentioned by the Prime Minister, I think, which were Urdu shares. And in also sort of uttered in the same way as, as if you're reciting a share. So even though it's sort of like a language which seems to be, an alien or to be diminished or like taken out from the borders, but it continues. And I think that's what Abdul Haq was saying, that I think this quote that I mentioned, which he gave in Punjab in 1948, that will always remain, it will always be there. And intrinsically, it has something, perhaps. Maybe it's orality, it's sound, it's some inherent structure, perhaps linguistics, which kind of maintain its appeal and its significance. So I agree with you on that.
Yeah, one point more, if you permit. It comes in strange places. You have strange experiences with it. You mentioned the parliament debate. If I recall correctly, it was Manmohan Singh. And replying to Manmohan Singh, Sushmita Sen was Sushmita Swaraj, who was the External Affairs Minister, also recited a couplet of Urdu. So that has happened in parliament. Another thing that happened very interesting, and I wrote about this in a column of mine, was that when Kejriwal started his party, he had a gathering where one of the posters was in Urdu, and people started objecting that this is Muslim appeasement. And I questioned, saying that why don't you question Kejriwal? Why do you question him for writing in that script? Why don't you question him for the name of the party itself? Aam Aadmi is Urdu. And why don't you advise him to rename his party as Sadharan Manush Party instead of Aam Aadmi Party? That would have been more Hindi. So you have all sort of strange things going on here and very interesting things, I must say.
And this is why I stick to calling it Hindi-Urdu, rather than saying Hindi or Urdu. For me, from this, I think that makes more sense to me too, to not say Hindi or Urdu. And this conflict is, I mean, as real and significant and concrete and political it's just, I mean, it's there, it's created and posed in that way, but it's just, yeah. So I prefer to call it Hindi-Urdu, and then also this is why I say world-literaturization or significance of Urdu or Hindi could have only happened together, and it does happen, let's say, as I mentioned about with regards to cinema and Bollywood, because it's not Hindi, it's called Hindi cinema, but it's Urdu, Hindi. So what do we call it? I mean,
I think the easiest way would be to call it Dakhni, because Dakhni was a perfect synthesis of the two languages.
Or Rekhti or Hindustani.
I think Dakhni would be perfect. Even today, people who know Hindi can understand Dakhni readily, and pure Urdu speakers have difficulty in understanding Dakhni.
I think these hot heads in Pakistan will be a bit like, oh, why are we calling it Dakhni? Because Dakhan is in India and not here. So, that's also why they'll have a problem maybe with Hindustani.
Well, the hotheads have already received a fitting reply, where if Urdu had been so binding on Pakistan, East Pakistan would not have parted on the basis of language, Bengali chauvinism or Urdu chauvinism receiving that backlash.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your both of your wonderful discussion and everyone for participating. And I think we have had a great evening. Thanks a lot, Hamza, for your presentation. We would look forward to continue this discussion ahead. And thank you all for joining as well. Sorry that I'm cutting the discussion, which can go on literally for a really long time, but because it's really early for Hamza and he's just gotten up for this presentation and for Professor Asser as well. Yeah, thanks a lot for joining in. Do join us for the next talks. We will keep you posted. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Asser.